Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to 2016 and a new series of the deep dives for the Foreman developer codebase. Today, we're going to come back round to have a look at the smart proxy, which is something we've not done for quite a while, actually. So I've got the sort of de facto maintainer of the smart proxy at the moment, Dmitri, with us, and he's going to give us a look over the current state of the smart proxy. We're going to look at where we're at with plugins, and slightly newer to that, we're going to look at how you can also write providers for plugins, which allows you to subclass the functionality in different ways. Think DNS, DHCP, this kind of thing. And then we're going to move on, have a bit of a look at some of the internals. We're going to look at some potential future plans, some directions we might like to go in, get some feedback from you guys. That would be amazing. So do join in. I'm watching on IRC. I'm watching the Q&A app. So if you've got any questions, please join us. And if not, obviously, we can continue the debate on the mailing lists afterwards. So with that, I'll hand over to Dmitri, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Greg, and hi, everybody. So depending on whether you wrote plugins already for Smart Proxy or just curious about it, so you may already know what I'm going to say, at least in the first part of this deep dive, but I just gonna have a very brief or somewhat brief overview of what we currently have and what it takes to write a very basic plugin. So for as you probably all know, we use Smart Proxy in Foreman at least project to provide APIs over various services such as DNS, DHCP, etc. So before this somewhat latest batch of work, you had to extend proxy directly, Smart Proxy directly, to add new functionality, or if you had some weird system, you had to, I don't know, probably create your own copy of Smart Proxy and extend it this way. Anyway, that was one of the issues with it, and so these days you don't have to do it. There is a system of plugins, and you can write whatever, you can add whatever functionality you would like to. So one of the simplest, the easiest plugins to demonstrate or use as an example is probably TFTP plugin. It's in the core Smart Proxy, so it's distributed together with Smart Proxy. You don't have to go look around for it. And basically all it does, it lets you upload and download files from TFTP, which we use internally. But because the functionality is so simple, it's actually a very, very nice example. So here, I opened it in GitHub, and probably most interesting files here, and also the files that you will need to create should you want to create a plugin, are the file with plugin in its name, which kind of describes what kind of plugin it is, and various kinds of metadata in it. We're going to look into it in a moment. There is a Rackup file. I'm going to talk about how we use Rack internally just right after I talk about plugin. And then there is the actual meat of the plugin, the stuff that exposes your API endpoints, which is essentially Sinatra, a tiny Sinatra application. So let's take a look at how we describe a plugin. So probably one of the first things to note is that you have to derive this plugin from a base class, just because it provides a whole bunch of methods. So the interesting things here, you have to describe what this plugin is called and its version. Versions internally used, you can define requirements, which plugins you need, etc., etc. But basically, it's just to keep track of plugins. The other two interesting things, we have two Rackup paths. Again, as I said just earlier, we use Rackup Rack to build the application from plugins, and we use Rackup files to tell Rack how to mount a particular Sinatra app. So here you see two Rackup paths. One is HTTP, another one is HTTPS. They are treated separately, and you can separately enable and disable HTTP and HTTPS in Smart Proxy now. And another interesting thing is default settings. Basically, these are going to be always present, whether you define them in config file or not. So if you define these settings in the config files, config file ones will take precedence. Otherwise, your plugin will be initialized with these. Also note they have to be present. So if you, for example, try to use incidentally or accidentally or not, if you try to set them to nils in the config file, this particular module will complain and will not start because it expects the settings to be present. Really, this is the simplest plugin that you can have. Some of them don't even have default settings, so it's possible. But plugin and Rackup paths are probably the only things you need to define.
Dmitri,
Yep.
just for the people, the fact that you've got http config.ru as the file name for both of those paths, that's not a typo, is it? You basically haven't got particularly protocol sensitive information in there, right? It works for both Rackups.
Correct. So in this particular case, the same Rackup file is used for both HTTP and HTTPS parts of the application.
Right. I don't know. Maybe I've got ahead of you. Maybe you were planning to open that file up in a bit anyway. But I just thought I'd point that out, that's not a typo.
Right. But yes, we have. I think it's templates module that has different ones. But anyway, it's possible to have different ones, different Rackups, and different mounting points for HTTP and HTTPS, and indeed even different API for different protocols. However, you have to keep in mind that it is possible to only enable one or another protocol. So this, if you're using or exposing your API differently under different protocols, you may want to mention this in your documentation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, it just occurred to me to point it out. That's all.
Thank you. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it as far as basic plugins go. So there isn't really much to it. We can touch later on. You can add validations. You can have, in case of tricky initializations, there are ways to defer initialization of your plugin and actually do some interesting stuff when plugin is being loaded. But we'll look into this a bit later. But yes, that's as far as plugin descriptors go. This is probably it. So let's take a look at the Rackup file now. So for those of you who don't know, Rack allows you to specify endpoints and then tell which class to use to or mount to a particular endpoint. So for example, in this particular case, we use TFTP endpoint or root, and then we use class proxy TFTP API to actually serve this particular endpoint. That's really all this Rackup does. Rackup file does, and we rely on Rack to actually bring this application up, this tiny application up, and mount it under TFTP endpoint. So now the actual API, the interesting things. So we use Sinatra for this micro, or in Sinatra language, modular apps. So we use Sinatra for this, and each each API set of API is a subclass of Sinatra base. So if you've written Sinatra apps before, this is pretty much it. There isn't really like it's just a Sinatra app. So for those of you who don't or haven't done this before, you can expose your endpoints as a method. So for example, post or get. You can also have delete, and I think in later Sinatras you can have head. I'm quite certain actually. And then there goes the next bit of the URL that this particular callback is attached to, and you can also pass either URL parameters, or in some cases we have method parameters. So for example, with posts, when you need to pass in other stuff into it. I don't see that we use it here. Oh, although we do. So for example, here we refer to proms passed, probably in post. Anyway, that's really all there is to it. So I'm not gonna go very deeply into it. One of some of the interesting stuff, there are smart proxy specific helpers. So authorize with trusted hosts, for example. As you may or may not know, we have a notion of a trusted host. So if you add this to your class, we will make sure that that the call is coming from a host that we know, or that you added to trusted host. SSL client is kind of similar, but works with SSL certificates. That's really it as far as very basic modules go. As you can see, there is really not much to it, and that was the idea. So another thing, depending on how you deploy your module, so if you're writing or your own, you'll probably have to deal with bundler. Well, actually, you will have to deal with bundler, and adding your module to smart proxy is a bit different. If, let's say, we compare it to when you're using already packaged module. So in the latter case, you usually don't really need to do much besides enabling module in the config file. So if you're actually using bundler, you will have to add a file to the bundler directory that we have, where we store all of the bundler configuration files. So, well, for example, we have a module called VMC, and so here it's bundler file, and you will need to load your gem in this file. If you have dependencies, other gems that you use in your plugin, you will need to create a bundler group and add those dependencies into this group. Make sure that the group is called the same as your plugin. So this way we will load it automatically. There's a way to override it, but I'm not going to go into this right now. It's just simpler to use the same the idea or the convention that the bundler group is called the same as the plugin. So what other things I can mention? Oh, and each plugin has their own configuration file. It's stored in settings.d directory. So we can, let's take a look very quickly at TFTP. So as you probably remember, we have in the plugin descriptor, we say that there's a default value for TFTP root property, but you can override it in this configuration file. Another thing to note, by default, plugins are disabled. So if you add a new plugin, you will have to make sure that you go into the into its configuration file and change enable property to true. After that, smart property will actually enable it on startup. That's it as far as basic plugins go. Do you have any
Dmitri, sorry, you cut out slightly there, at least for me, and maybe not for everyone else. Did you mention the fact that the enabled can also take one or other of the protocols?
No, I did not. Thank you for reminding me that.
Your microphone is very jittery. I don't know whether you're bashing it with a sleeve or something. There's a lot of scuffling in the background.
Try to lean in and speak up. So
it's not volume that's is the issue. It's there's a scuffling sound, like you're dragging something over the microphone or something. Sleeve. Or...
Interesting. I'll try not to drag anything over the microphone from now on.
It may just be your internet connection. Anyway, I'll stop derailing.
Okay. So as Greg reminded me, enabled property can have also HTTP and HTTPS in it, in which case only that type of or that protocol will be enabled for your application. Sorry, for your module. So, and if you set it to true, then both will be enabled. Again, it also depends what your global configuration says about HTTP and HTTPS. So basically, like if both are available, then both will be enabled. If only one of them is enabled, then only that one will be enabled. But anyway, you have control over what protocol you enable for a specific module. Any other questions or comments?
We've got nothing coming in on IRC or the Q&A app at the moment. I think we're good to carry on a bit further. I'll just add to what you were saying though about the enabling, disabling. It's actually really handy when you have a plugin that only works on one of those protocols. So the example is always with the template proxying, because, for example, the Debian installer doesn't support HTTPS installations, right? So if you normally default to using HTTPS with your proxy, but you try and proxy your templates, it all just falls apart. So you might as well disable it. It's useless. So it comes in handy in situations like that, and also where you don't want to expose something insecure, right? So then you only enable it on HTTPS.
Right. Okay, I'll carry on. So as Greg mentioned, there's a notion or abstraction called provider. So providers are or were rather introduced to allow us to abstract backends. So probably easier to demonstrate than trying to explain it in some abstract term. So we have a couple of modules, and I think I'm going to use DHCP as my example. That can have different backends. So, for example, DHCP can work with ISC DHCP daemon, or we also can use Microsoft DHCP server. So depending on how you deploy your proxy, you can use one of these. We also use Virsh, but that's pretty much development only environment provider, so I'm not gonna spend much time on it. So depending on your environment, so you may want to use one or another, and the internal implementation is different enough that you cannot kind of create a common way to interface with these servers. So for this precise reason, we introduced the notion of a provider where your main module can use one of these providers to actually talk to a particular backend and contain all the logic required to talk to this backend, while the main module itself essentially just exposes the API endpoints and calls. For the rest of the stuff, it just relies on providers. So let's take a look at I don't know, DHCP ISC provider. And there's some differences in how you describe providers and main plugins. So after we look at DHCP ISC provider, I'm also going to take a look at the changes required to introduce them in a plugin, in a module. So again, the structure of provider is very similar to that of a plugin. Probably one of the main differences is that providers do not talk over the network, or at least they do not use HTTP, and they do not expose anything directly. So they use main plugin for that. Because of this, there is no Rackup files, and usually we don't use Sinatra to actually create functionality for a provider. At least I can't quite imagine how that would work. So plugin itself, or provider rather, so one of the first things you may notice is that it's derived from a different class, again, because the DSL, domain specific language we use to describe provider, differs slightly from that of a plugin. And just to catch some differences, so I figured that it probably would be better just to keep them separate. This is interesting. This is a slightly older implementation. It's still valid, but I would probably caution you not to use it. And I'm going to show you how the more up-to-date way to do the same. So again, the plugin thing that uses or defines the name for this plugin, its version, bunch of default settings. Again, it's very much the same as a regular plugin. First interesting thing, or another interesting thing rather, so we say that we require a specific plugin. So basically, if during startup we do not see this plugin available, this will be disabled and we won't even consider it. Another interesting thing is, here's an example of a validator. So what it does, during initialization of the plugin, it goes into properties listed here and makes sure that we can reach these files. And again, if we cannot, for whatever reason, it will complain in the log and then disable the plugin, the provider. And I'll talk about after initialization stuff in a little bit, just not to put too much information right now. So let's continue talking about providers. So those are probably the main things. So now, if we take a look at the DHCP main module, which is defined in the DHCP. So you can see that this is actual regular plugin. So we have Rackup file, we have API, or file rather, that defines the API. But let's take a look at the plugin because it contains the other portion that specifies what that we actually use providers with this plugin. And here is the line that's interesting for us. So what it means that when we're initializing plugin and we come across this statement, we know that we actually need to look for providers. And this statement affects the initialization order of in which individual modules are loaded and are initialized. So to be precise, when this happens, we look for providers available for this plugin, and based on the setting, so use provider setting to be precise, we look for specific provider, initialize that provider first, and if successful, we initialize the main module after that. If any of this failed, then we disable the main plugin and its API endpoints are not going to be available. Basically, this is done to well, we're trying really hard to launch Smart Proxy. So we try to isolate various failures to modules, and we rather disable particular module rather than fail the whole proxy. So default settings again, so if you don't override this setting in the config file, by default we use the DHCP ISC provider. That's really all it says. So now, if you remember, I mentioned that DHCP module uses slightly older way to specify how to initialize the provider. So DNS module, on the other hand, is more up to date. And if you look at it, it's also, well, obviously we use providers there, and it's a little bit different. So if you look at the plugin line, you won't see anything but the name of the plugin and its version there. So what happens internally is that we rely on something called dependency injection to define, to specify particular implementation for particular label for particular class that the main module expects. So it's fairly easy to use. The concept itself might be a little bit more complicated, but you don't really need to understand that much of dependency injection. The main thing is that to know is that we specify a key for to use, and a class that's tied to this key, and that will be instantiated when you ask to give you something with this key, this label. And so in this case, it's DNS CMD implementation for our DNS provider, and we just couple these two things, so the DNS provider and the concrete implementation. And when we actually use it, which is in the main module, and it's referred to in, I think the only place we refer to it is in the API file, in API class. So we refer to it this way. So the first parameter is the label, the key that we defined in dependencies file, dependencies class. And the second one is how we refer to an instance of this class inside the API class that we're looking at. So for example, here is how we refer to it. It might be a little bit convoluted or difficult to grasp at first, but if you just take a look at the source files, it kind of will make sense. I promise you that. Obviously, always available on the IRC, so if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. So that was the tricky bit about providers and the main differences. I promised you to talk about after initialization block. So let's take a very quick look at that. So yes, here we are. Again, we're back to the DHCP ISC module. And what happens here is that after the module's been validated, loaded, settings defined, etc., etc. So basically very basic, very low-level initialization stuff. We arrive at the moment when we're ready to load, well, this module meet its main files. And you can do it in the after activation block. Basically, this is executed as the last step in the module initialization process. The reason to do that is that sometimes you may have third-party dependencies that are not available when Smart Proxy brings up or loads your module. Or maybe there are additional checks, validations that you need to do that you cannot do by using available validators what have you. There are tons of reasons why you may want to do it at runtime. That's a good spot to do this. So what this in turn means, at least for DHCP IC provider, is that unless it gets enabled, none of these dependencies are going to be loaded. So we're saving a little bit of memory. Not huge, but it helps. That's probably one of the main reasons to do that, actually. So another one is that it forces you to do as much initialization as possible in the plugin descriptor itself, or rather use as much validation as possible there. So we fail quickly, we fail as opposed to when the smart proxy is already running and then you discover some inconsistencies in configuration, for example. So it's better to do it here. I can't think of anything else to mention here. Just for those who like to write their own plugins, there is a template in Smart Proxy GitHub. Foreman GitHub repository. It's called. It does have template in its name. I forget now the exact name, but again, if you look me up on the RC channel, I'll point you towards it. There's also developer docs that mention it, and there's also developer documentation on how to write plugins, which you may find interesting, and it's on the Foreman wiki. I think that's all I had to say about plugins, providers, and how to write them. Any comments or questions?
There doesn't appear to be much coming in from our viewers at the moment. I'll add a few comments of my own. So I just had a quick Google on GitHub. I'm guessing you're referring to Smart Proxy DNS plugin template.
Yes, that sounds about right.
Yeah, there we go. So that's the repo if you want to go and have a play with that. If you're interested in Smart Proxy plugin providers, then there's two more things we can say. We have a talk on one that's already been written at Config Management Camp in a couple of weeks' time. So Ewoud has written a DNS provider for, I think it's for Power DNS, and he's giving a talk on that, which is going to be interesting. And I believe yourself, you're going to be at the Hack Day on Wednesday the 3rd. So again, if people are trying this out and getting stuck and they happen to be in the area, then that's something we could potentially pick up there.
Also true.
So if we're all done with providers, I believe we were going to talk a little bit about sort of internals and bundler and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, I can go over it once again. I think I already mentioned it very briefly.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what our pre-show chat.
Right.
Is that because you mentioned you wanted to talk about loading and things like that? So.
Yeah, I talked about it during when I was talking about plugins, just because it was
okay. Fair enough.
pertinent.
I must have missed that. My apologies. So I guess we're on to talking about so that's the current state of things, right? So the proxy itself has been around ages. This plugin stuff is all kind of cool. Providers are fairly new, so it'll be good to see what people are doing with that. What's on the radar? What's coming up? Do you think? Obviously, we're prognosticating and putting our Nostradamus hats on.
Well, I'm gonna split it, and it's kind of partially on my plate, partially I'm thinking about this. So some of the things are kind of still in the air, up in the air. So probably for people who rely on Smart Proxy and use it in large environments, couple of things that are important are and are on my plate are changes to DHCP providers, namely ISC and Microsoft one. So ISC, we have rather significant performance issues there. So the idea is to speed it up so it's usable on large networks. And large networks, we're talking thousands of hosts, hundreds of subnets. Similar issue with DNS Microsoft implementation. So also performance issues there. And one of the approaches I'm considering is switching to native Microsoft API to talk to the DHCP server, so which should significantly improve the performance.
Yeah, I mean, ISC is a pain, right? Because the lease file is just
Yes,
a huge, long pile of text, and there's really, if you've got a lot of hosts, it's just a big file, and you still have to parse it, and it's just horrible.
Yes, and there are issues with consistency, so we basically can't really just look at the tail of the file, etc., etc. So one of the things is to switch to, or at least something I'm considering at the moment, is switch to a MAPI interface for majority of the operations, where we can query and change and add records to the DHCP server directly. It's still not quite native. It's still going to be through, through MAPI, so which is a command line utility, but it should be better than parsing this potentially huge file.
Yeah, it would be nice to get away from that because we've had so many problems with it in the past. That'd be cool. Also, I would, if anyone out there wants a challenge, I would love to see a proper provider for DNS mask. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. Maybe I'll try writing it. But yeah, sorry, I've derailed that entirely.
No, more on the internal side of things, or architectural, is I've been thinking about introduction of events to Smart Proxy, into Smart Proxy. So right now, we basically all we do is we use Logger, and we log things when something happens or doesn't happen, different levels of logging. There are some changes or requirements downstream, which also kind of affected my thinking. But with introduction of eventing system, we could instead rely on events, which at first could pretty much be very similar to logging, but at the same time, it would give us ability to filter, collate, pretty much slice and dice events as you see fit, which potentially gives us a lot of flexibility about how we can look inside what's going on in Smart Proxy and report on, well, pretty much its internal state or state of any of the modules. Although it's a somewhat significant internal change, significant departure from what we have right now. So this might take a while to introduce.
What does that expose from an external point of view? I mean, obviously, logging is nice, but it only goes to a file at the moment. So presumably this now becomes more of an API type thing.
Yeah, for example, it's not the only way to do it, but again, because of the flexibility eventing system introduces, we could potentially expose events that are happening in the proxy on the whole or individual modules. For me, particular interest is ability to introduce performance monitoring, because we sometimes have users complaining that thing is very slow, but this will give us more quantifiable metrics for slowness.
I guess the other obvious things are, obviously we can report things back. The Foreman's web UI can obviously consume some of that to get, because we've always had problems with displaying what goes wrong when it goes wrong on the proxy side, right?
Right.
So there's that, which we could improve, presumably. And I guess the third thing that jumps into my head, although I don't know if this is directly relevant, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like you could use this as the basis of event machine type stuff, right? Or state machine type stuff, where you're building a process, and some of that process involves the smart proxy, so you can get events back from the proxy to say, well, let's take discovery as a great example, right? So what state is my system in? You know, has it booted? Has it rebooted? Is it in discovery state? You know, the proxy knows some stuff about this.
Yes, absolutely. You can certainly couple events and event machines to make well, stateful transitions. Well, things like this. It could be a rather powerful combination. Yeah, for sure.
Sure. And obviously, and presumably this is per module, right? I think I saw some discussion about this already, but presumably if this is per module, then obviously any plugin kind of gets this for free, right? So if you're an external person writing a plugin that's specific to your infrastructure, well, now you've got free eventing on that part of your infrastructure, right?
It's probably implementation dependent. There probably will be some basic stuff that you'll get for free, but existing modules will have to make some changes to actually fully.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, sure, you'd have to add some code to your plugin, but that's kind of expected, right? But my point is, with the infrastructure in the core of the proxy there, right, then for little effort, if you're writing a plugin, then you get something nice back. So
yes, that's the plan. That's the idea.
Cool. That's very exciting. What else is do you think is on your radar, or is that kind of the current sort of future scope?
Yeah, both are quite significant, so I'm trying not to look too far. There are always plenty of bugs to look into as well. So
of course. All right, let's turn the question around then. What would you like to see? What interests you? What would the community be potentially doing that might be of interest to learn about?
Well, I'm obviously always would like to hear about pain points, because evolution of internal architecture is, at the moment, is driven mostly by the pain points that I discovered, that I find. And a lot of them are centered around things: how easy it is to write tests, how easy it is to test smart proxy itself and its modules. So a lot of, like, if you're not sure why a particular change was made, it's either bug fix or that.
Sure.
So, and as you can see, it's a bit skewed towards my priorities. So I definitely would like to hear about the community and their pain points, especially about writing new stuff. So how easy is it for you, or what difficulty you've encountered?
Yeah, I'd also like to know how much use people are making of the API of the smart proxy directly. Obviously, we consume API from the Foreman web UI. But we have control over both ends of that. So if we need to change things, we can. But at the moment, the proxy is an unversioned API, right? So we are always kind of wary when we're playing with this stuff. And I'd be really interested to know how many people are building things directly on top of the smart proxy API, and would therefore be quite upset if we change things.
Right.
So
right now,
it'd be interesting.
Right now, my policy is, and it's one of the things I try to enforce very well, enforce, and so far I've been successful with it, is that existing endpoints, changes to existing endpoints have to be backwards compatible. New endpoints, at least in the core, we have to think very hard about adding new ones, just to ease future changes. Something like versioning of API is definitely something I have in mind. It's just, at the moment, again, it's not as a high priority.
Yeah, it's low priority. Yeah,
need to be. But if it is, then do let us know.
Absolutely. What was I going to say? No, I guess you're right, because I mean, if you're adding stuff, that's not so bad, right? I mean, it doesn't break anybody's things, but yeah, you have to be very, very careful. It's the old saying about, I used to be a sysadmin, right? We always used to say that you know, you can spend forever on things, but the hack you do at the end of the day will live in production for a year. So yeah, you've got to watch it. Okay. Anything else we should cover?
Not that I can think of.
All right then. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap it up. So thanks very much for your time, Dmitri. For those watching live, thank you for joining us. For those watching in the future on the YouTube recording, this is not the end of the debate. Do get in touch via the mailing lists. There's a thread devoted to this event. So if you've got any questions or any comments about how you're using the proxy or what you would like to see in the future from the proxy, let us know, because we really want to hear it. So thanks very much, Dmitri, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.